Hello, and welcome to another episode of Boundless Body Radio. I'm your host, Casey Ruff, and today we have another amazing guest to introduce you now. Phoebe Lapine is a Brooklyn-based chef and author of 4 books, and is the founder of Feed Me Phoebe, an award-winning lifestyle and recipe blog. Being the daughter of a terrific cook and as an only child of 2 creatives, her father is a Tony Award-winning director and playwright, and her mom is an Oscar-winning documentary filmmaker and screenwriter. Wow, that's incredible. She was always encouraged to find her passion. On a personal note, Phoebe is an advocate for autoimmune disease and finding food freedom despite chronic illness. She had been diagnosed with an autoimmune disease known as Hashimoto's thyroiditis and learned that she was very sensitive to gluten. This was pivotal in helping her develop her outlook on wellness, what she calls healthy hedonism, that sweet spot where the things that nourish your body overlap with the things that feed your spirit. Her most recent book, Carbohydrates, 130 healthy recipes to stop fearing carbs and embrace the comfort foods you love, is a culinary and dietary roadmap for making a carb-inclusive diet part of a healthy lifestyle and nutritious life. She can be found on Instagram at Phoebe Lapine. Phoebe Lapine, what an absolute honor it is to welcome you to Boundless Body Radio.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
It is such an honor to host you. A lot of our audience may have heard that title and said, wait a second, what did he say about carbohydrates? We get requests all the time for people that want to come on our show, and I got an email a few weeks ago, and it said we've got a great guest. She wrote the book called Carbivore. She'd love to be on your show, and I responded. I don't often respond, but I responded to this when I said maybe you got the wrong number, wrong email address, like carnivore, Carbivore. It's a one-letter different. It's pretty close, understandable. And she replied back and said, you know what? No, Phoebe would actually love to have a conversation about this. She's got really, really great insight and would love to just chat some of these things out. And I have so much respect for that. You sent me an electronic copy of the book, which I've read, and you did a fabulous job. I love it. So I'm not coming here with torches and pitchforks because you wrote a book about carbohydrates. You did a fantastic job, and I just have to say kudos. You did a great job on that book.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, it's a cookbook, but I tried to make it educational as I do with all things for people who are just struggling to understand how carbs fit into our general health picture.
Yeah, well, you did a great job. I like how, again, most of it is a cookbook, but the first few chapters explain kind of the science about carbohydrates, what they are, where we get them, kind of some of the issues of where we've gone awry with carbohydrates. And maybe we're blaming certain, the whole macronutrient when we could be more specific and blaming parts of the macronutrient. And again, you and I were talking a little bit offline before this episode, and a lot of our audience has found health and healing with low carbohydrate or ketogenic or carnivore diets. I don't think a majority of people need to do that. I think there are people that have food addiction issues, maybe some mental disorders, people that could just do okay, with that carbohydrate very, very low. But I also find that that's not a majority of the people. It's a certain subset of people. And even then, it may only be for a short amount of time that they need to do that before they can start including more and more carbohydrate foods back in. We see that all the time. And so, again, I think this is going to be a really helpful episode for people that know that they can tolerate some amount of carbohydrates just fine, and they can just focus on different things like you write about as far as like quality and things like fiber and things like that. So again, I think you did a great job, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, before we get going into some of the content of the book, let's hear your story and how you got interested in health and how you got interested in nutrition in particular.
Absolutely. So I had a corporate job right out of college, and on the side as a little creative outlet back in the dark ages of blogging, I started a food blog. It was like .blogspot and all of that. Nice. I don't know how old you are, but it'll be a nice throwback for some people who are maybe in their late 30s like me. But that kind of catalyzed a whole new career opportunity. And I, as my bio mentioned, have always been super driven and interested in food and had a real passion for cooking. And so I got a cookbook deal pretty early on because it had an interesting niche that I didn't feel at the time that anyone was speaking to, which was just cooking for in a small kitchen for young people. I call those quarter life cooks who had limited time, resources, and money. And on the eve of that book coming out, which, included a lot of my childhood comfort food favorites, like the best grilled cheese and chocolate chip cookies and all that, I started to really dial in on the fact that I was having some very, very unfortunate health symptoms, and ended up getting diagnosed with an autoimmune disease, Hashimoto's thyroiditis. It's really actually very common and very commonly diagnosed for women in their 20s. And I was very lucky that my everyday, GP doctor at the time did a full thyroid panel. So many practitioners do not. But of course, being kind of immature at the time, being 22, I just was like, oh, I need to be on medication for the rest of my life. La 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 la. I'm going to pretend that that conversation never happened and just like go on living. And so I really, in that time, unfortunately, really wore myself down to the bottom of health mountain. I had terrible insomnia. My hair was falling out. I had really bad skin issues. Was so fatigued, which is a real hallmark of having a slow thyroid. Had to stop exercising because I had such bad stomach cramps. My gut was like a true mess. And so that all kind of led to a breaking point. And this is a long story. I'm going to have to cut it short, but really got me thinking about health and having to pivot this entire career that I thought I was about to build, being an omnivore and a chef. I gave up gluten, which was kind of the first big dietary makeover that I had ever had. And I definitely went through all the stages of grief with that. It was just 13 years ago. So the resources weren't really there that they are in the supermarket today. But essentially kind of feeling really conflicted between the Western medicine point of view of here's a pill and you'll be on it for the rest of your life and you'll be fine. Then getting a little bit more well acquainted with the integrative point of view, I also felt rather alienated by that side of the story. I really felt like everyone online was just giving me this insane laundry list of to-dos that, again, as a young person, didn't really fit into my budget, didn't really fit into my lifestyle. I was like, how am I going to throw out my entire apartment and replace it all with, organic cotton and baking soda? So I ended up writing my second book, which is called The Wellness Project, about really drilling down into kind of the overarching, bare bones, common sense areas of health that I wanted to work on. Everything from hydration, sleep, alignment, stress management, of course, diet, of course, managing some of those vices like sugar, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, a lot in this conversation. But it was how I kind of honed that philosophy that you mentioned, the healthy hedonism, because I didn't want to just aim for perfection. I found myself when I was really kind of getting more into a biohacking mindset and testing my thyroid antibodies, every month or so to see what was changing, I really felt like my mental health was deteriorating. And I really didn't feel like I was necessarily finding what I would define as health in the process. So it was kind of a short-term set of experiments, not terribly, scientifically valid in terms of like the biohacking end of things, but really more to figure out what was worth my time, money, and energy. And this is something that I've really carried through all of my work. It was a project that really resonated with a lot of people who followed me, and I found a lot of my community in the autoimmune world and the thyroid world. And then my third book was about SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And that was, again, another thing that I dealt with off the back of working on my Hashimoto's. And really, there felt like there were no resources that were substantive at the time, at least in book form. There was a lot of kind of small practitioners who were leading the conversation, who were specialists, and some like fringe websites and blogs. It was definitely considered a mainstream diagnosis, but there just weren't the resources behind it. A lot of gastroenterologists were prescribing something called the low FODMAP diet, but didn't really understand kind of the mechanisms of why it was working for people. So I ended up writing that book, which is a hybrid cookbook and kind of a treatment guide for people that does tackle the low FODMAP diet and some of the more specific SIBO food guides, including talking a lot about lower carb approaches to that condition. And then after the fact, I got a lot of people who, were just really struggling with how to reintroduce certain carbohydrates and how to deal just with kind of the fear that had become ingrained in the idea that carbs were the enemy, that carbs were going to make this acute condition come back, that they were going to be part of the merry-go-round of relapse. And a lot of people in the Hashimoto's community who I felt like were really confused around carbs as well. Autoimmune paleo is kind of a common diet prescribed for that, not necessarily by practitioners, but by some dietitians. And it's more just like in the zeitgeist of, the autoimmune community. And so, yeah, I really wanted to kind of, as a carbivore myself, someone who loves carbs, who I think has found, a nice happy medium in my lifestyle for incorporating them. I wanted to really help people figure out how to do it without causing, some of the metabolic issues that we see. I wanted to teach people how to do it while honoring kind of the long-term health of their large intestinal microbiome, and really just talk through kind of some of, the pitfalls that we see with carbs. And then, of course, from a culinary perspective, since that's my background, I wanted to also look at how we've changed how we cook carbs over the years and how that has had a substantive impact on our digestive system and on our blood sugar metabolism. So that was a
Yeah.
very long-winded
Well,
how
what a
I got
wonderful
here.
what a wonderful journey you've been on. I think it's so cool that you were one of the very first people to write about SIBO. And it might be a good time to say, like, you actually did an awesome podcast about this where you've recently
Oh,
done
yeah.
a few new episodes, but that's a really great resource that people can go and check out as your original podcast where you kind of talked about that for a series of, I believe, like 50 episodes. Quite comprehensive.
Yeah, it was meant to be just a 12 episode, one off. Like, you got diagnosed with SIBO, listen to these 12 episodes and we'll walk you through, kind of everything you need to think about, like how to change, certain structural treatments, how prebiotics and probiotics factor in, every kind of like niche topic. And then it was like I had opened up the can of worms and I couldn't stop. There were so many great guests, and we really did nerd out on a variety of gut related subjects, both SIBO related and just, more general. So yeah, eventually after I published the book, I hung up my mic for that, but I had to chime back in, and do a little bit of a deeper dive than what I was able to do in this cookbook on, carbs and the IBS community.
Excellent. Well, that's great. I think that'll set up perfectly where this conversation can go. You do a great job in your first chapter, before the first chapter, actually, of talking about what carbohydrates actually are, and you break them down into different categories. So, can you kind of give us a good outline of, what carbohydrates are, where they come from, and how we can kind of think about them and classify them as different kinds of, if we want to think of it that way?
Yeah. And I think it's really important that we start with definitions. I did in my SIBO book as well, because there's a lot that just gets thrown around as slang, like low carb. What is low carb? I think what we call a carb is actually different than what a carbohydrate actually is, which makes up, pretty much all of plant matter on Earth. And also the conversation around complex carbs versus simple carbs. Basically, carbohydrates are made up of glucose molecules. There are different types of sugars. So carbohydrates include all sugars, glucose being the simplest of which, fructose being another type of sugar, and then sucrose, which is 50-50 glucose and fructose. Then there is starch and there is fiber. Both of those two things are complex carbohydrates, which basically just means that they're made up of multiple molecules of glucose. Fiber is interesting, and we'll talk about it a lot because it can't be broken down once those molecules have been formed together. So it's not something that really affects in a negative way our blood sugar. It doesn't get broken down, doesn't get absorbed in the small intestines, passes on to the large intestines, where it has a function of feeding our good gut critters, of our microbiome. And I should say, I'm sure everyone on this podcast is very savvy and knows, but the bacteria in our body outnumbers our own cells 3-1, and they're super important. And I think it's been the most exciting element of research in the last decade in terms of, what the health of our microbiome can dictate in terms of our immunity, in terms of our mental health, and so many other things. Certainly the tie to so many modern illnesses. So yeah, and then starch, is a complex carbohydrate. It includes, a lot of plant-based seeds and grains. So, everything from rice and quinoa to legumes, also root-based vegetables. So potatoes, sweet potatoes, tubers. And depending on the amount of fiber in that starch material, or that starchy plant, if there's less fiber, our body can break down that chain of glucose pretty quickly. So I think people call white rice a simple carb, but I mean, it's not. It's a complex carb. It's a grain, but there's less fiber in it. So it does kind of act more like a simple carb once it enters the body. We can break it down really quickly, and then that glucose just enters the bloodstream.
Got it. And contrasting that to sugar, where everything is getting in very, very, very quickly, correct?
Yes. So if we have just pure sugar, and by the way, natural sweeteners, unfortunately, the same thing
Yeah.
as table sugar, which, tends to be the one that's demonized. High fructose corn syrup, higher, anything that's higher in fructose is going to have a different impact. But generally, in terms of absorption, on an empty stomach, that sugar can reach our bloodstream within 5 minutes. And the issue that we really see with metabolic health, with our blood sugar metabolism, is when you have too much of a good thing all at once. And our body, therefore, has to package the excess away, oftentimes into fat, and particularly with fructose, it tends to end up as fat.
Got it. Okay, excellent. So check me on this analogy. See if you agree or disagree. When I'm trying to explain this to people, I kind of like this analogy, but I want to see what you think. To me, the bloodstream is where things are trafficking around. It's where those carbohydrates end up eventually. And so to me, that's like a freeway. So if I'm thinking about sugar in the freeway, I'm thinking about like an unmetered kind of an on-ramp when it's rush hour traffic. If you don't have a meter there, all of the cars during rush hour are getting into the freeway, and that huge rush of cars is very problematic. There's way too many cars on the road. There's traffic jams, accidents, and all kinds of things. And those cars can't be there. They can't live there. They go to traffic, but they have to go away. And so I'll say that like the exits are like where the sugar can go. Insulin is the signal that says, okay, cars, way too many of you on the road, go find your parking space. And we have some parking spaces for carbohydrates. We have a very small amount that we can store. And so the carbohydrates that we consume, those cars on the road, will go to a very limited amount of parking spaces. But as long as you have the spaces, they'll be there and they'll be fine. And they can park. And then when the traffic clears and they can go back on the road, they'll go drive again. If those parking spaces are full, then the body needs to create more parking spaces, build a new parking garage, which ends up being fat. So you're ending up taking the carbohydrates with the liver, switching them over to fat, and then packaging them away in new parking spaces. That's kind of how the sugar works, in my opinion. With the starch, it's way less of a problem because now you put a meter on your on ramp. So yes, cars are getting on the road, but it's way more consistent. You hardly even notice the flow of traffic. It's way more even over a long amount of time as the body is breaking down that kind of more complex molecule into the usable form of glucose. That's kind of my analogy. Thoughts on that? Is that close the way you
I
think
think
about
it's
it?
close. Yeah, sure. I mean, it's a little bit more complicated than that. I'm like, oh, is the liver like the traffic cop? Is the insulin like, the baton he's waving? I don't know. We'll have to think through the metaphor a little bit more. The visual that I like to give people, in terms of, I think, kind of the on-ramp for you is, the intestinal wall in our small intestine. So the analogy that I like to give people, because it's visual, I've actually done, an Instagram reel if you want to see it in real time, but is that our intestinal wall is kind of like a fine mesh sieve. So the beauty of fiber and why it's so important, in kind of slowing our carbs roll to our bloodstream, is that it can, while it doesn't get absorbed, it can literally muddy up the sieve. You think about, kind of if you took an apple and put it in a mortar and pestle, which is essentially kind of what we're doing, hopefully, for chewing our food properly with our mouth, with our stomach. We're, churning that apple into pulp. So if you were to pour straight apple juice, which has all the fiber removed, through that sieve, it is going to be an unobstructed waterfall. It's going to be all your cars coming, at 5 p.m. LA traffic onto the freeway, as you said. But if you were to eat the whole apple, which has all of, well, you may not be eating the seeds and the core, but has, some skin and some plant fiber, to create this kind of slurry, this sludge. If you were to muddle that through your fine mesh sieve, it would kind of create this protective seal. You would still get the sugars, of course, you would still get the liquid, the juice, the sugar coming through, but it would be more of a drip drip versus an unobstructed stream. And the beauty of that is that then if you were to have just the straight sugar, the straight apple juice after that, if you try and pour that through the sieve when there is already fiber present, it's still going to take a little bit longer. So that is kind of gets to the crux of what's happened in our food system when we remove fiber and increase the sugar in packaged foods, or even not, even just in stripping it from white rice, stripping it from, the brand, stripping the bran from our flour, which is all, I won't say it's the complete origin story, but is one of the things that we did simply to make food more shelf stable and to last longer. And then I think things obviously got obscured for less practical purposes and more greed oriented ones. But, sugar also, in terms of packaged food, is a preservative. There's a reason why, we canned peaches back in the day in a syrup. It helps things last a bit longer. And again, fiber being present in things causes food to spoil more easily. So anyway, it's not to say that it was all bad intentions wise whenever we started to preserve our food. But yes, in terms of the way that foods are industrially processed today, we've gotten really far from how we were meant to be eating certain plant foods, and mainly in the role of fiber.
Yeah, gotcha. I love this line. I'm going to read this out. How do we hold these two truths? Because you do a great job talking about the problems of overconsumption of, especially like you mentioned, the carbohydrates that are way too sugary. It's in virtually everything. It's in the middle part of the grocery store and everything. It's anything you can get at most restaurants. And again, I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, but the way you say it is like they're delicious and we're driven to want cake and fries, but they can also harm our health. So how do we ride that line? And I love the way you, and again, I'm paraphrase how you said it, but it's a really great question. And so overall, I think you kind of hit on that just now, but can you reiterate again, how can, if we are driven to want the carbohydrates, which we certainly are, how are we able to maintain metabolic health, including some of those things without getting carried away?
Yeah, and it is really tricky. And I want to acknowledge that, kind of our reliance on the grocery store to begin with is convenience. We've gotten a little bit addicted as a culture to packaged food, to the convenience of it. And I am not someone who is like on my homestead churning my own butter. Like I have a 1-year-old in the other room, and I too really require convenience a lot of the time. And I think just my perspective overall is trying not to shame people for that and trying to meet people where they are and giving people a really diverse toolkit to kind of pick and choose different modalities depending on their lifestyle, depending on their unique circumstance, depending on their unique body, to kind of offset some of the chaos that carbs we love can cause in the body.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. As we're moving forward from this, I just want to point out for all the listeners who are in the low carb space or are eating a carnivore diet, I've got a list of questions of things that I completely agree with you on. You do a great job writing about. I've got another list of questions that are just like questions that the low carb community would have, and I really want to focus on the first ones. If you're listening and hoping that this is going to be a debate of any kind, you're going to be disappointed. I'm again so grateful that you'd want to come on and help educate us about this. And again, I don't want to focus on the things that we have differences in. I want to focus on the things that we talk about that we can all agree on. If you're listening and you're concerned about oxalate, guess we've done an episode about that. If you want to talk about blue zones. We did an episode. We did several episodes about that. Like you can find some of this other content about fiber and all that other stuff. But I just the stuff you write about is really where I want to focus. And you do a great job also talking about what I would argue if you ask 100 people on the street, 99.5 people would say, if you ask them, what do I need to be healthy and lose weight? So many of them would say, you need to move more and you need to eat less, calories in, calories out. You
Mm.
write about this in the book. Tell us how you think about calories as far as weight loss or weight gain.
Yeah, I think calories are pretty meaningless, honestly, at the end of the day. I mean, it's um, a metric for like burning food in a box, and it doesn't really have anything to do with how we interact with food in real life, and particularly when it comes to our blood sugar. Um, 200 calories of apple juice versus 200 calories of whole apple. I just described to you the difference. And in terms of, weight loss, I do think our metabolic health, I do think controlling our blood sugar, I do think feeding our microbiome as more of the long-term view of that is hugely important versus calories. I think in the 90s, we got really, really waylaid by the low fat movement, which also I feel like really was when we increased our conversation around calories. And the irony, as you kind of described with your traffic model, is that when the packaged food industry takes fat out of something, the carb count goes up. I like to think about yogurt in particular because I think as a child of the 90s, I was like, oh my gosh, low fat yogurt, like flavored with fruit jelly in the bottom is so healthy. Um, but it's, and Snackwell's cookies, all of that. But it really was a deal with the devil because while the package promised less fat within the container, through the mechanisms of our body's metabolism that I just described, when we have too many carbs all at once, too much sugar all at once, our body will then convert it into fat. So you're almost guaranteed more fat inside your body as a result.
Yeah, it's very well explained. You mentioned your age being late 30s. I'm 40, so we're about the same age. So yes, we
Okay,
lived through
cool, cool,
the
cool.
90s and this at the snack well. We probably at my house, if I think about it, we probably had whatever like generic brand of snack wells. We were probably too cheap to afford the actual snack wells, but definitely lived through the
I
low
know
fat
which one you're
era.
talking about. It's like the supermarket devil's food cookie,
Yeah,
Yeah. I
yeah.
know what you're talking
Cheap Mormon household growing up. That's what I would have had for sure. Not the real brand name. But yeah, you think about the kind of the how that all happened and the order of events of like all of a sudden it's the mid 50s. These middle-aged dudes are dying of heart attacks, so we think it's cholesterol. So then we think it's saturated fat in particular, and
Yeah.
that evolves into demonizing all fat. And fat has more calories than carbohydrates. We take all the fat out of everything, add all the carbohydrates, and it was only to solve that one real issue. Mostly males, mostly just heart health. We didn't
Yeah.
study females. We didn't study children. We didn't study reproductive health or mental health or any of the other things. It was just for the one thing to help fix heart attacks. The number one killer in America today is heart attacks. It's such a
Yeah.
bummer that we pushed so hard down that path and we thought it was going to be this panacea of health and help dudes with heart attacks and ended up causing so many other issues in the process, including obesity and the diabetes and all these mental issues that we didn't have to deal with in the past. It's just crazy to think back on.
Yeah. I mean, that is like my blanket complaint when it comes to nutrition science in general is that I think, it's so hard. We get so far away from common sense and intuition and the way people lived, 100, 200 years ago when some of these diseases were rare. And especially when the packaged food industry and innovation comes into play, it can allow us to get even further away and create, a whole host of other problems that we didn't foresee just trying to fix this one minute thing.
Yeah, yeah, very crazy. You write about this as well, which is like hidden sugar. You think to look at an ingredients list and you might come across the word sugar, but the industry now has become very clever in the way that it can kind of hide that and kind of dilute it out. Can you talk about like some of the different names that sugar has and how the industry is able to add way more hidden sugar than most people would ever know?
Yeah, I mean there it goes by like 80 plus different names, and I think now that there's this focus on natural sugar, quote unquote, versus, processed sugar. I mean, all sugar is processed for the most part. Your beet concentrate is still coming from a sugary vegetable, even though it's from a vegetable. Again, once it reaches your bloodstream, it's all the same thing. But the reason why I think I call it mindless sugar in the book is so important to focus on is that it is one area where I think that we can maintain our hedonism while making incremental improvements for our health. I think a lot of people just don't take the time to look at the back of the package, to look at the ingredient list. So, who would know that our sandwich bread and our peanut butter have sugar in it? It's definitely not the same amount of sugar as an ice cream. But my question is, would how brand loyal are you? Like, if you were to switch that to a peanut butter that didn't have the added sugar in it, how much less pleasure would you have in your life? And how much more room would you be creating to maybe have a bowl of ice cream at the end of the meal and feel less shame for it? So I think, yeah. And my problem, I think, with diet culture in general, and especially with the packaged food industry, is that even, with the rise of low carb diets, with paleo, with keto, there are still brands that are going to slap that label on the front and put tons of sugar in the back. And the reason why they do that is to make it taste like our favorite junkie snack well cookies from childhood. And I think people feel real safety in those labels. And it kind of absolves us of, the need to spend the extra time, digging into what's on the back. And that's not to put the onus on the consumer at all. It really sucks that, the food system is so stacked against us and that we have to work so hard in order to just get our basic freaking peanut butter and not bread free. I don't know what you're putting the peanut butter on, just spooning it into your mouth. Whatever floats your boat.
Yeah. It's a huge problem. And you mentioned even in the paleo and low carb space, it's a huge problem. Filmmaker Vinnie Tortorich has made several documentaries in the last few years about, the two are called Fat and Fat 2. He's written a book about the fake meat industry called Beyond Impossible. He's making a new movie that's not going to make him very many friends, but it's called Dirty Keto. And it's going after all of these brands that are making profits on what they call, now keto products. This is a marketable thing that people are going to buy. I remember the first time I saw, I think it was Slim Fast. We just lost Slim Fast as a potential sponsor of our show, but I saw a Slim Fast package of like keto something in the store, and it was like 10 or 11 bucks. And it was like 6 servings of 0.5, I can't remember, ounces per serving. And it was 6 of them for 10 bucks. I picked up the package. It virtually floated off into outer space. It was so light. There was nothing in it. And these poor people spending all this money on this crap that they're calling keto. It's like, you're missing the point. We want to eat real food. It's not about eating processed crap, regardless of what you call it.
Right. Agreed.
Yeah. Well, awesome. You also write about the what has been known as like the Dorito effect. So now we're taking, combinations of this processed carbohydrate. We're adding them with fat, with salt to get this very kind of addictive type of food that hits all these different pleasure centers in our brain. And, the saying, like, you can't eat just one is literally a case with some of this processed food. It's not just that hidden carbohydrate, it's all the other stuff that goes with it.
Right. Totally. And that's like kind of the point with mindless sugar too, is that you could be having those dopamine hits, having that addictive reaction without even knowing it. Again, without having any conscious pleasure and without having the mindset, to moderate. We think, okay, like ice cream's ice cream, it's a treat. I'm going to have it at the end of the meal. Again, when I hopefully have fiber, protein, healthy fats, all sorts of other things in the tank to slow down that sugar before it reaches my bloodstream. But, first thing in the morning, you think, oh, almond milk, oat milk, that seems like a healthy choice. And you don't look at the back of the package. So many of those are like barista blends now that are full of added sugar. You add it to your tea or coffee, you drink it on an empty stomach, that's going to impact your cravings for the rest of the day. And I would definitely, file under mindless sugar. And also, single it out as an ingredient as a food product that you probably have every day. So the mindless sugar that I want people to pay more attention to are the things in your household that you eat on a regular basis every day, especially the things that are on an empty stomach. And then, you'll kind of either make a conscious choice to yourself to say, no, that's my favorite thing. I'm going to keep it. I'm going to use X, Y, and Z other tactics to kind of flatten the curve and figure out a way for it to cause less cravings throughout the day. And maybe forego the bowl of ice cream, or you're going to say, like, why wouldn't I just switch to something without any sugar and have a bowl of ice cream at the end of the day?
Yeah, gotcha. Okay, I think that's a good strategy. One tool that you talk about in the book also is a continuous glucose monitor. I'm really glad that this is starting to gain a little bit more traction. I think it does have some limitations, but I think overall, for a lot of people, if you really want to be aware of how some of these things are impacting you, a continuous glucose monitor would be an interesting tool that somebody can use. And so, can you say, like, in your experience, how you've used that personally, and how again, you're not a clinician, but the things you've heard about people using them to be able to help them sort out kind of which carbohydrates are okay for them and which ones are probably best avoided.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting experiment. And it's unfortunate that in this country, we don't have access to the continuous glucose monitor, CGMs, over the counter. Um, so I had a workaround to get a CGM since I don't have markers for diabetes or any reason that a doctor would prescribe one for me. So I used the company called Zoe, which is, I think, a really interesting direct to consumer company that's helping to kind of help people understand their blood sugar metabolism and their gut health. There's another one called Levels that also will give you a continuous glucose monitor. But I wore it for 2 weeks, which is kind of the length that the monitors usually work. And I thought it was really, really eye opening to see in real time. I was doing a few little experiments along the way, but for the first little bit, was just like living my life and seeing, what certain ingredients that I did eat every day had on my blood sugar. And I actually think some of my eye opening things was I was eating certain packaged foods that advertised low sugar, high fiber, and they spiked me just as much as like a regular candy. So I do think that packages lie to a certain extent. But then also it's interesting to compare your reaction to certain foods with my husband who wore one too. I mean, we are totally different people, man, woman, what have you. But everyone kind of needs to choose their own little adventure. We all have our own sensitivities, and a meal that's going to impact my blood sugar might not impact yours. And the things that I could do to moderate that might not be the same things that are affected for you. We're all incredibly different. So I think that was really eye opening. And then some of the experiments that I did, and some of them were prompted by Zoe, was to start the day with a bowl. I did it with a bowl of white rice to eat the carbs on an empty stomach, see what happened. Then the next day, eat the carbs, but with half an avocado or with some sort of vegetable with fiber, and to see, how the curve differed. And then to do that same thing, to eat the fiber first, to eat the avocado first, followed by the rice. And then to use a few other strategies like moving after a meal. So eating the bowl of white rice plain, but then walking for 10 minutes afterwards. That one was actually like really eye opening for me. That had a huge, that was incredibly effective for me personally. And I know it has been for a lot of people. But then also, seeing what caffeine on an empty stomach will do. Before you have whatever breakfast of choice that is. I don't know, just really drilling in on the learnings versus getting too bogged down by individual meals and what was it that, made the impact. I think tracking, I think testing is really effective for short-term sprints. And then for some people can pivot into being a little bit too much of an obsession where you'll see kind of diminishing returns in the consistent tracking. But I think CGMs for a short period of time to give you that overview, and to really, give you a toolkit to factor in your own symptoms. And I have a symptom tracker that's part of the book that, takes into consideration, your energy throughout the day. For women, tracking menstrual cycles, because our menstrual cycle is very much tied to our blood sugar metabolism. Where we in our cycle might mean we have more volatility when we eat that bowl of white rice on an empty stomach in the morning versus at another time of the month. The type of sleep that we've gotten, our stress, all of these are so important to kind of factor in addition to what we've eaten, to see, again, to hone in on our triggers and how food makes us feel.
Yeah, that's great. I think that's totally reasonable. The thing I notice with people is, I guess what we're looking for is like the major diversions, or if your blood sugar looks like a roller coaster, and I hate roller coasters. If it looks like that all day, that's not going to be great. Like you shouldn't have highly fluctuating blood sugar all day. That's going to have downstream health impacts. If you can get those curves a little bit lower, the area under the curve is much better. That's going to be a lot more helpful. But it's also not to expect that it's always going to be flat and exactly
Right.
zero. It's like I get annoyed when people say like, oh, I've got high cortisol. Well, sometimes you should have high cortisol. You don't
Mhm.
want to have high cortisol all the time, and there's things we need to do to address that. But you need cortisol at certain times of the day, and it's just one of those things that kind of fluctuates, and you should kind of expect that. I don't want to see it be.
Absolutely.
It's great as a tool, but not to be used all the time. And this is the end all be all.
Right. And yeah,
Yeah,
that is one of my pet peeves now that people are talking more about CGMs and about glucose spikes is, the concept of a spike to begin with. I mean, it's again the volatility, as you mentioned. One glucose spike, in your day is not going to, mean you like are going to live 10 fewer years. Like it's about
right.
the long-term
Yeah.
goals and our long-term health.
Agreed. I heard just a few months ago that the FDA did approve CGMs to be used over the
Oh,
counter. So we'll see how if that becomes a more popular tool or not. It's interesting to kind of think about and
fingers
see how it's.
crossed.
Yeah, there you go. Maybe it could help. That's great. In the book, you also say like most people can do really, really well with halving their carbohydrates, cutting their carbohydrates by half. And I agree. I define low carbohydrate nutrition as 150 grams of carbohydrate or less. You do a really great job with your recipes as far as classifying them. I believe you use like slices of bread, like a one
Yeah.
is a lower carbohydrate, a two is a little bit more moderate, and three is a little bit higher. And it's like you said, you can choose your own adventure. There's going to be people and times where the three carbohydrate type meals in your book are not going to be the best ones for them, but they can choose other ones that are a little bit more lower carbohydrate. So I think you did a really good job making that distinction in the book as well.
Yeah, and by the way, the three toast recipes are usually just the desserts. My desserts are I have the sugar for sure for a regular baked good, and truly, like I don't notice a difference because my taste buds have changed over time. I say in the book that the beautiful thing about cooking and about having that control and making, the food yourself at home is that you can kind of slowly retrain your taste buds. Unfortunately, the way our brains work, we'll always want sugar, a little bit, we will want a lot, but our taste buds are a little bit more adaptable. And I really don't derive the same pleasure that I used to from having a cupcake, out on the town. It's just too sweet for me. So I don't know.
Great.
Again, there's not tons of dessert recipes in the book, but there's kind of one per chapter. It's all divided up between type of carb, the book, and it's yeah, just an option for people who want to have a sweet treat that's not as big of a sugar bomb. But
Totally.
three toast recipes.
I like it. No, I agree with the taste buds thing because it's really interesting when people start to address their diet. I almost encourage them to kind of like go off and like go to the party and have that piece of cake. And it's
Yeah.
just like they remember it being something totally different. And it's almost like gross. They can taste chemicals, or like you said, something
Yeah.
can be way too sweet, or even like you eat an apple and you're like, wow, that's really sweet. Like it didn't used to taste as
Yeah.
sweet as it did. That can definitely change.
Yeah. I mean, when I did the wellness project, my first month experiment was removing caffeine, alcohol, and all added sugar. I still ate whole fruit for a month. And yeah, I was in a different place in my health journey. So that was a very extreme change for me. It again meant I couldn't eat any of the packaged foods really that I had bought. And it was really, really eye opening. And the sugar withdrawal was also eye opening. It was much more intense than caffeine, which I, have taken out from time to time. But I really noticed by the end that my taste buds changed. And I kind of ran a group coaching program after that where I called it the Vice Detox at the time. And we do a mini Vice Detox for just 5 days, just a week. And even then, I mean, people have some incredible aha moments just from those 5 days, which is, I think I put it in the book as one of my first steps to kind of taking a sugar break is just doing it for a week. But there were certain things like sriracha was a big one for people. Like no one really thinks of that as being like a sugary condiment per se. But now, even me personally, it's like if I have it, versus other hot sauces. I'm like, I really taste the sweetness. Sometimes I
Interesting.
love it, but I taste it.
That's interesting. I think most people who eat sriracha would probably try to punch you in the neck if you tried to take it away from them. People love
They
sriracha.
and that's I'm not trying to take anything away from anyone.
Good
You
call.
you keto folks, you carnivore folks, you keep on keeping on if you feel good. Yeah, I am not in the business of trying to change people's lifestyle, change people's minds against their will.
Yeah,
I'm more about trying to meet people where they are and giving them a variety of tools to
I
feel
love
a little
that.
better.
Yeah, I love that. And you do write about taking a break from sugar in your book. I'm really glad that you included that. What are some tips and tricks? Sugar is delicious and amazing, and it's really, really hard to quit. Like you said, the withdrawal symptoms can be quite intense for a lot of people. And especially around here. If you were around where I live, there is a soda shop like on every corner. Not only like the gas stations where you can go buy giant sodas, but like soda shops where you go and get a gallon
Yeah.
of soda with added flavorings and a sugar cookie. They're like literally a 10-minute walk from my house has a grocery store that has a bakery and two or three just dessert places as part of like five different stores in the same complex. Like you could go
Yeah.
get cookies and cream puffs and all this like baked goods are not baked in the best way. Like it's pretty crazy out there. So what things do you recommend to help people kind of take a break from sugar?
Yeah, I mean it's an uphill battle. I mean, even at the doctor's office, the adult doctor's office, there's usually like a bowl of candy on the checkout. Like, why? Why? Um, so I'm glad you mentioned the soda shop because people I feel like are clued into the idea that soda is not healthy, but I think the entire beverage industry is like one big vat of mindless sugar that people don't think enough about. People are like, "Oh, I'm going to drink my coconut water, my kombucha, my juices, my smoothies. Those are healthy drinks." And, I'm not saying that you can't have any of these things ever, but we drink them in a much more mindless way than we eat our food. And again, the sieve, the highway analogy, whatever you want to use, that sugar it's going to be consumed faster and it's going to hit our bloodstream faster as a result. And there's nothing else impeding its entry into our bloodstream. So I think if there was one baby step you could take without eliminating sugar completely, it would be to not drink your sugar and just take that as a baby step. But generally speaking, I actually think when it comes to sugar, doing the cold turkey experiment is really important just as a reset. Again, just to kind of re-examine your own sense of pleasure, to kind of hone in on not just the physically addictive quality but the socially addictive quality, as you mentioned, like dessert, and I mean alcohol too for that matter, is very much a part of our culture and a part of hanging out with other people. And I think whenever you quit something, it also brings out a lot of social tension sometimes in your friend group, can make other people uncomfortable. I know a lot of people who I've taken through my program have had some really eye-opening experiences in terms of, what's mindless for them just as a social, as a bit of social pressure. And when you're doing it with awareness and you kind of can gauge people's reactions, a lot of family members too, I feel like can have their own opinions about your changes to your lifestyle. Um, and as you said, once you reintegrate, really having your taste change and acknowledging that and kind of taking that as a baby step to move forward, that's really important. And
Yeah,
then,
I
yeah,
agree.
I think kind of number one thing going forward, if you were to seek some sort of moderation, is to not eat sugar on an empty stomach, which means most importantly, not necessarily eating a sugary breakfast, which, 75% of the typical American breakfasts are sugar-based breakfasts, or have added sugar added to them. And then as snacks, again, thinking about the packaged foods that we eat it from the grocery store that are convenient, it's usually snack items. And I am kind of an evangelist for breaking up with snacking as a habit in
Love it.
general. It's kind of where the Venn diagram of blood sugar science overlaps most heavily with what I've learned about our gut health. And when we go back to thinking about the CGM and that blood sugar volatility, you know, unless I have never been on a strict carnivore diet, so I don't know what my CGM would look like as a result. But, when we eat, generally, it's going to include a little bit of glucose. Our blood sugar is going to rise as a result. We're putting fuel in the tank. It's kind of the nature of the beast. So if you want to eliminate some of that volatility, it's a matter of just not eating every single minute of the day. Even if you're eating kind of a carbivore, high fiber approved snack like a handful of almonds, if you're doing that every 5 minutes, you're going to experience a little bit of volatility. Also, more importantly, in terms of the digestive process and how our machinery functions, it is really not the way that we are designed to eat. So we have this street sweeper wave in our small intestines called the migrating motor complex, the MMC. It's something that I hadn't really come across in my research prior to my SIBO book. But for those who know about small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, it is kind of one of the hallmarks of what can go wrong and can cause, a buildup of bacteria too far up your intestinal tract. So our small intestine, again, it's where we absorb all our nutrients. It has a larger surface area than a football field. It is incredibly craggy and winding. And so we really need this street sweeper wave in order to clear the decks after a meal and to make sure that we don't have these food particles, these fibers that are, fast food for our gut critters hanging out in a place that they're not supposed to be. Because again, then that means that our gut critters can propagate where they aren't supposed to be either, instead of moving along to our large intestine. So our street sweeper wave, or MMC, only kicks in during a fasting state of 90 minutes or more. So again, if you're eating those almonds all the time, it can be a healthy choice for someone. It's one of my favorite snacks. It is like going to be preventing your digestive system from functioning the way it's meant to be, and can cause, SIBO, IBS, not all on its own, but it can be one of the factors that contributes to your digestive system not working like a well-oiled machine.
Yeah, I love that you bring that up. You talk about this in particular with fruit in the book, but like the way we think of almonds today is very different than if you ask my 93-year-old grandpa about almonds. Like he got them, he had them for sure, but they were like Christmas, and you had to work a tremendous
Yeah,
amount
you
to
had to
get one of
break
them.
them open. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, it took a lot of work. It wasn't the same as we think of today, where you can get the giant bag from Costco and just have 20 at a
Yeah.
time and 20 at a time and 20 at a time. And I don't know many people who like have a handful of almonds and couldn't immediately have another handful and another handful and another
Yeah.
handful. Gets a bit tricky, but that's a really good point. And we've talked so far a lot about what we eat. You do a great job in the book talking about how we prepare our foods in particular.
Yeah.
And you do include grains. You definitely make the caveat of like how our grains have changed over time and which ones we should be focusing on, but also how we prepare them. Like before I started my carnivore diet, I was making sourdough bread, and it was a 2-day process from like
Yeah.
whole wheat berries ground up, and it took a long time, and you needed the starter, and it would make amazing bread that would be good for like a day and a half before it was hard as a rock. um, but it was delicious. It was really, really good. But that's a totally different thing than the way we think about bread today. So can you tell us a little bit
Yeah.
about the cooking process and how that can help? And in particular, resistant starch. I think a lot of people think this is actually like super weird, but it's a really cool way to think about preparing carbohydrates.
Yeah. So, first the bread, and this goes for pasta and some other carbs as well. It was something I really dug into when I was researching the rise of non-celiac gluten sensitivity, because there are so many theories that people have. Our wheat, people say like our wheat is GMO, blah blah. Wheat's not GMO; it's hybridized. But also, I think people aren't, and there's the pesticides question. Okay, all these things. But just the way that bread is made is so different than it was 100 years ago. So the way that you have two benefits for what you're doing. First of all, you're using a sourdough starter. So it's a bacterial process that literally will eat the carbs in the content of your loaf. So it's lowering the overall carb content. It's also making the gluten easier to process as well. So when we make bread in an industrialized factory, we are not using that starter generally. We are also speeding up the rise time, and we're developing the gluten with industrial mixers much more quickly. And another way that we can create that elasticity in a quicker way is to add even more gluten, something called vital wheat gluten, an actual ingredient that can be added to bread. Anyway, I'm getting away from the general point, which is that, I call the philosophy of the book not low carb, but slow carb. But, these processes, the way that we used to make carbs that, fueled whole civilizations, whole societies have lived just off of various types of bread. Are very different than what we have today. So it's not necessarily that, bread is the enemy. Let's look at how we're preparing it and see if we can get a little bit back to our roots, and to prepare it in a way that our digestive system and our blood sugar is a little bit more tolerant of. So pasta is another really interesting example too. I know that there are people with non-celiac gluten sensitivity who go to Europe and they're like, oh, I can, eat pasta in Italy. I can eat bread in France, no problem. Unfortunately, that's not me. I'm so jealous. But when it comes to pasta, again, the kind of point of view of people was like, oh, there's, less gluten in the flour. They're using flour that's, not covered in pesticides. And the interesting thing is that semolina or durum wheat is actually a higher gluten flour that they tend to use in Italy for the pasta. And they do that because, again, you want to have the most elasticity, that great bite, as much as possible. So gluten is a protein that helps with that. The difference is, though, is that when you make the pasta, you lay it out to dry, and it's a very slow process. Think about it back in the day, it'd be drying in the sun. Well, today, in factories, they flash dry it. So it happens, very, very quickly. But the result of that, and, as a carnivore, maybe this analogy is helpful for you, is the protein seizes up. So, when you sear meat, you want to let it rest afterwards. Again, like kind of dramatic. You also kind of want to sear meat not directly from the fridge. Any sort of kind of intense temperature change can cause those proteins to seize up. So as a result, a lot of the pasta that we deal with today has those gluten proteins that are just really, really hard to break down and harder to digest. And it's not necessarily that there's more gluten or less gluten. It's just that the composition, because of how we've prepared it, how we've processed that pasta, is different. And it's a little bit harder on our body.
Yeah, that's very interesting and well explained. And then can you talk about resistant starch? I kind of asked way too many questions.
Yes.
I asked too many questions all at once. So I should have
No,
spaced
it's
it out a
good.
little
It's good. So resistant starch is really interesting. It kind of acts like fiber in the body. It's a type of starch that can't be broken down, doesn't enter the bloodstream. So again, just passes through, and it's another source of great chow for our good gut critters. So in its raw form, a lot of carbs have, a higher ratio of resistant starch than in their cooked forms. So one way to kind of shift the ratio again is to actually, once you've cooked a carb, to cool it down again. And that helps to develop the resistant starch. And the interesting thing is that even if you heat it up again, it's going to stick. So I like to use it just, I like to not be crazy about it. I'm not like cooling down all of my carbs and then heating them up again. But I think of it as just, an added plus that if I'm eating pasta as a leftover, it's going to be a little bit better for my blood sugar than if I was having it straight from the pan.
bit.
And yeah, it can be a tactic that you can incorporate to have kind of incremental improvement on some of your favorite dishes.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. That was very well explained. My last question for you, I'm just very curious to hear your thoughts about this. I have been on what I would define as a carnivore diet for over 5 years now. I define carnivore as it's defined in nature as at least 75% of your calories or more coming from animal products. I go to conferences, I meet people like my friend Robin. My friend Robin has been bipolar most of her life. She's been heavily medicated. When she eats carbohydrates, she has bipolar symptoms. When she takes them
Mm,
all out, she is no longer bipolar. Like you talk to her, she's just completely
mm,
normal and good and fine, and she's fine. But then she has a crazy response, and her cholesterol will shoot up way super high. So now you've got people that are making like really bizarre decisions about like I can have carbohydrates, my cholesterol will go down to a normal level, but now I'm bipolar. What do I choose?
mm.
For me, like I hear you talk about moderating. I love it. I love that concept. I wish I could
Yeah.
do it. The last time a few weeks ago that I decided to do something that was off of my normal diet of like steak and eggs and the things I normally eat, I wanted to eat a peanut butter burger. And so I made a burger with a bun and I put peanut butter on it. Sounds gross, but it's so good.
Okay. I'm
You
not
have to try it.
sold, but go
I'm
on.
telling you, it's got the sweet and the salty and the savory. It's really good. My jar of peanut butter in 3 days was gone. It was gone. I finished it all. I can't moderate, and I get anxiety, and it's not the
Yeah.
worst, and it's not terrible, but like like literally to tell you, like I don't eat any. I have not eaten hardly any fiber, some carbohydrates, but hardly any fiber in like 5 years. And there's tons of people that have been on this. I'm just curious, like, what do you think? Is this like the most bizarre thing you've ever heard of?
Well, the peanut butter burger, yes. No, I'm just kidding. I don't like to yuck someone else's yum in food or diet. No, I mean, I think it's interesting. I think, first of all, I think that not everyone, I think there are certain categories that people fall into when it comes to habits. When I've seen it, particularly in terms of diet, I think there are some people who are like my mother. My dad refers to her as like, she has the willpower of a prisoner of war. Like she could just like tomorrow, like adopt a new diet. It's not hard for her. It's not like a point of stress, and she just does it. Like she has no misgivings. Um, and, it's just like kind of a switch that flips on and off. So jealous. I think that's the minority of people, by the way. Then I think there are moderators like myself. I feel deprivation when I have to be on a rigid diet or when I have to find rigidity out in the world. Kind of one of my big things with the wellness project and my experiments was I really wanted to kind of set myself up for success at home so that it allowed me more flexibility out in the world. That's kind of how I found my own moderation in certain areas. This is like a little bit more from like the toxic load than it is necessarily for food, but does apply to food as well. Again, with, the everyday ingredients you buy, the everyday groceries, I set myself up for success at home, and then I go out and I just do not stress as much. I just know it's not going to be as healthy. It's not going to be like my optimal when I'm out there, and I just forget it because I'm having, 80% of my meals at home anyway. And then there's the people who I don't know what I would call you guys, but I do think it's most people, and it's not like necessarily a willpower issue. I guess I call them sprinters. They're it's what people are who are yo-yo dieters. And I actually am not saying necessarily that this is you, but do really well with a strict, set of rules. Unfortunately, if you fall off the wagon, it's like, you know, all hell breaks loose.
Yep.
Because the moderation inclination isn't there. I do think it's really hard to try and train someone act against, that just like genuine habit instinct and turn someone like that into a moderator. It doesn't always work. And I think it's hard. I don't know what the solution is, to be honest. And it does make things like sugar a slippery slope because sugar is addictive. And carbs to a certain extent are too. I mean, less in terms of our dopamine centers as, as clinically so. But yeah, at the end of the day, though, it's like we all, like, most people do need to find the moderation, regardless, because the yo-yoing doesn't really work either. And for a lot of people, unless you're in that one small camp of the prisoner of war camp, sticking to a rigid diet forever doesn't work either. So I like my conversation with a lot of my followers and readers and whatnot is really just about like the mindset piece, and about trying to not putting all of our eggs into the food basket. Because while I truly do believe that, food can create incredible transformation, it's, also a source of pleasure. It's a part of our culture. It's a part of our social life. And I would never want, someone's dietary choices to detract in a really negative way from those elements of social wellness. So kind of why I wanted to add some of the tips that I did in the book. And it's not just like, fluff. It's actually, data backed and important. But, if the food element is stressing you out, or if you fall off the wagon and, you eat outside the lines of what you feel is optimal, there are other ends, there's movement, there's sleep, there's stress management. And believe it or not, again, like your sleep really does have a huge impact on your carb tolerance, on your blood sugar. Stress has a huge impact on your blood sugar and your carb tolerance. I mean, it really is one that I think from a common sense perspective, people can understand. I mean, when we have these stress hormones circulating in our body, our blood sugar level naturally goes up. And that's because back in the wild, when we had those stress hormones circulating through our body, it was a survival instinct. We needed to know that there is a big cat in the corner about to come get us. And we needed the extra blood sugar in our system, the extra glucose, the extra energy to fuel our muscles to run the hell away from it. So unfortunately, when we talk about kind of, as you mentioned before, cortisol levels that are raised for too high for too long in a consistent way, part of the issue is that, there is no physical threat and there's no physical response. So there's nothing, our muscles naturally bring down our blood sugar because they require energy in order to function. So when that's not happening, again, those levels remain elevated. So that's kind of how our stress response works, just as a baseline for how we react to food and why, if people are getting too stressed about the what of it all, maybe it's focusing on the culinary side. Maybe it's making your own pasta, finding some joy in some of these habits. And maybe it's just taking a break from focusing on the food at all and just living and really digging into sleep, really digging into stress management. In general, again, I just think there are so many different ends. And the most important thing is not to feel shame when we don't, you know, eat or live according to our own mantras and our own parameters, a lot of which are imposed by others.
Yeah, that's right. Well, that was a very thoughtful answer, and I have quite enjoyed this conversation. It would have been very easy to, look at what we largely do and what you do and say, like, look, we're too far apart. This is such a chasm in how we approach things. And when you dig in, like, we've got so many things in common. And you're right, like we have too much processed food and sugar is a problem, and we could start there and work on some of those other things like you mentioned, and people could get much much healthier. It's really rough out there. It's not the best.
Yeah.
So I love the way you approach things and write about things. It's really helpful.
Yeah, there are a lot of baby steps to be had. And that's, by the way, not to say that, again, some very intense sprints aren't helpful. I mean, certainly in the SIBO community, doing a restrictive diet like the low FODMAP diet, even something called the elemental diet, which is just like a liquid like nourishment, can be really beneficial for 2 weeks. There's a time and a place for different approaches, for different diets. And my wish is not to convert, anyone in your community or you to eat carbs. I'm not like telling people that they have to. Um, it's more to just show that there can be, a pendulum that swings back and forth over the course of your life in a way that's not necessarily unhealthy. That's just meeting you where you are at a certain point.
I love that. Well, Phoebe, where would you like people to go to find you and connect with you in your work and find your book?
Okay, well, I'm on Instagram at Phoebe Lapine, and I have a blog, feedmephoebe.com. And then you can find out more about Carbivore at carbivorecookbook.com. But I have a ton of free recipes on my site. They are not all carb inclusive. There are some that fall under the paleo category. I don't have any carnivore recipes, sorry, but some good
That's okay.
marinades. You could have
Okay.
some good marinades for your summer steak on the grill.
That's awesome. No, I love that. So one time I was kind of explaining the way I was eating to somebody. He was like, "Wait, you don't like rice? You don't like bread? You don't like pasta?" I'm like, "No, I love those things. Like,
I
trust
love
me,
it.
they're
Yeah.
delicious. I love them. They just don't do very well for me personally, but I do love them. And your recipes look delicious. And again,
Thank
I
you.
think this was a really fun and productive conversation that people could be very thoughtful about how they approach food, not just for nutrition, but all those other things you mentioned, the culture and showing love and traditions and all that other stuff. So thank you so very much, Phoebe, for being willing to do this conversation. I had a great time chatting with you, and I really appreciate and respect your work. So thank you for taking the time to do this.
Oh my gosh, I loved it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And this has been another episode of Boundless Body Radio.